right, here we are at church again. It's good to have everyone here, and we are in Exodus, right? Once again, looking at some things here about the children of Israel. I do have some handouts this week. Maybe you could do that for me. Just give one to everyone. And what we're doing today is we're going to look at the 10, which are the 10 commandments, in light of, because we've already talked about the 10 commandments, but we're going to look at how some of the laws that Moses received from God mesh in with those 10 commandments. Because there's a hierarchy in the way that God communicates to us, meaning he gives us like an ultimate, total picture of what he's about by saying the greatest of all commandments is that you love God and love others. And so we start there, but that's the pinnacle. And then it begins to spread out from there, and it goes to the 10 commandments, which are, okay, how does loving God and loving others look like in the basic form? And then we get into chapter 21, 22, and 23, where he begins to spell out, okay, this is what the 10 look like when we begin to apply them in our daily life, okay? Because, you can come to someone and you can say to them, love God, love others. And they say, sure, that's easy, right? I can do that. But then life happens, right? But then life happens, right? And then you say, and then it's like you forget love God and love others. And so by having concrete examples of what it means to love God and love others, it gives us guidelines to say, okay, in the moment of I forgot what it means to love God and love others, God gave me the 10. And he reminded me with those 10 what it means for me to love God and love others. And I'm going to review the 10. Okay? The 10 are this. And it starts with, number 1, you shall love the Lord your God, serve him only. What does that mean? It means God first. Above all, God is primary. God is ultimate. God is the one who we revolve our lives around. Number 2, I had it down as flee idolatry, but we don't really understand what idolatry is in our world today. So I've been thinking, and I only just came up with this other alternative. Don't worship created things. What's an idol? It's a created thing. What is a person? A created thing. What is a demon or an angel? They're created things. So don't worship creation. Or a positive way of saying that is worshiping creation harms you. Worshiping creation is dangerous. Number 3, represent God's name. That's what it means to not take the Lord's name in vain. It means that we carry the name of God. And so therefore, we represent God's name everywhere we go. We carry his name. The 4th one is rest. Sabbath rest is ultimately about making sure that we understand that we are designed to function with periods of rest in our life. Number 5, we honor others. It's talking about honoring your father and mother, but it's ultimately talking about honoring people, honoring others. In the New Testament, I think Paul says, give honor to whom honor is due, right? Which means that we start with a culture of honor. Number 6 is not really about murder, it's about protecting life. It's about, in every area of our life, we need to protect life. Number 7, It's talking about sex. And the ultimate thing about number 7 is sex is sacred. And therefore, we should do it the way God says that we should do it. Number 8, that was a hard one for us to understand because, remember, it says in our English version, don't steal. But we think in terms of like physical objects. But in that world, it meant no kidnapping, right? Slavery, don't enslave others. So what it means for us is that freedom is central to how God created us. And we have to protect freedom for ourselves and for others. We have to do things that create atmospheres of freedom. We have to pass laws that ensure freedom. We have to make sure that we do not do things to others that keep them from being free. Number 9, it's truthfulness. It's not just about not lying, it's about being truthful in everything we do. And number 10, about coveting other things from other people, really it's about being content. Contentment. So we embrace contentment. So now we take a look at Exodus. And we'll start in chapter 21. And I'm going to read. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm just going to read and I'm going to do commentary on the text as I go through it. Because what I want us to begin to do is understand that God is trying to help everyone who reads Exodus to understand that he's trying to move them towards something. He's trying to move them towards this new ideal. And for us to understand that, I'm going to have to give us some background on the world that they lived in at that time. Because we don't have slaves today, and it starts out in chapter 21 with slavery. Well, there are slaves today, just not in where we're living right now. Not at least in a visible way. There are slaves, but it's not a part of our culture. We reject slavery. And so we don't understand in verse 20, like chapter 21, verse 1, it starts with these. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, what's a Hebrew slave? It means a slave of someone who is from your own country, your own nation. So if you take someone from another family and buy them as a slave. Now I'm going to stop there because we don't understand that. How can you buy a slave, and what does it mean in that culture? In that culture, there weren't banks. You couldn't go and just get a credit card. You couldn't get a loan to go and buy something. You had to save up money, and then you had to go and use that money to purchase whatever you wanted. But if you got into debt, meaning, okay, you said you were going to pay for something and then you didn't, you couldn't just go and find a way to offload that debt to an institution. There weren't institutions, there were people. And so if you got into debt, the way that you paid off that debt was to sell yourself as a slave. Okay? So you spent too much money on your credit card, you couldn't pay the bill, and now you have to go and sell yourself. So this is the point I'm trying to make, is that this is people in their culture who didn't manage their money well, or a crisis happened and they ran out of money, and the only option available to them was to say, okay, well, I guess it's time for me to go and work for so-and-so as his slave. That was their culture. That was now, here's the thing about that world, though, is that slavery was the foundation of the economy. Meaning that this was how it was done everywhere. There was no such thing as an employee-employer relationship. There was a slave owner-slave system. So if we want to think about this in terms of our culture, this is someone going out and getting a job. That's what it was. Instead of them working for themselves, owning their own property, raising a crop or having a herd of cattle or whatever to make money, or doing some sort of craft like a carpenter, they would sell themselves as a slave in order to provide for their family. Not a very good culture. Not a very good situation. But if we understand the world that was around them, okay, and this is really this is where we need to understand the ancient Near East culture, is that all of the nations around built their nations and their economies on forced slavery, meaning kidnapping. They would go to war primarily to take land and capture slaves. They would go to war in order to acquire people who they could then use in their economy to create this monetary cycle within their nation. And so what God is doing here is he's saying, okay, I'm going to, and this is something that we need to understand, is that God can't take a culture beyond where they are in one big giant leap, right? In other words, God can't say to the Israelites, slavery is wrong. Eventually, we understand that God was moving us towards that idea that slavery is wrong. But in that world, you can't take that huge leap from a world that's totally embedded in forced slavery to a world in which there is no slavery, and there's something called employees that voluntarily come and go as they want from job to job without repercussion. There is no way to bridge that gap in a short span of time. It takes generations to make those type of changes. And so when God gave the laws that he's given in the book of Exodus, he's giving them to a culture and a people who understand the world at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we have to read these words from that perspective. We have to understand it, that this is their world, not ours. So let's carry on. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. Which means, after 6 years of service, in the 7th year, whatever he owed you, doesn't matter how big the debt, whatever he owed you, he's free. What law does, which of the 10 does that follow?
8.
Number 8, freedom. And also, I think it represents number 5, honoring others. Right? And
4.
number 4, rest. Right? Because there's a rest from the labor. Right? You paid your debts, you're set free. It's interesting that it's the 7th year. Right? Just like the 7th day. You're free from your labor. Okay. Now here's some of the things about this. If he comes in, which means that if he joins you as a slave and he's single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. We just think, yeah, that makes sense. Didn't make sense to their world. God is giving redemptive laws here, meaning that the laws that God is giving are so contrary to the world that they were living in that they were like, God would do that? God would let my wife come out of slavery with me? Because there was this, like, that's not the way things worked in the world, in the countries around them. Verse 4, if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. Now that's a hard one for us to read, because we're thinking, what? Yeah, my wife, my children, they don't belong to me? But the key is that the master gave the wife to the slave. And she was not free. In fact, there's something about this, like women were property in that culture, in that era. They belonged to people, just like people own cars and own houses. And so this master owned the wife. She was not free. Gave it to her. And God is just like, there are some laws that we look at and we say, okay, I don't understand it. How is this possible? And when we read that, we say, God is not fair. Now, in that world, there were no ways around this. But if we keep reading, we're going to discover that God brings context to this situation, because it says right here, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. So in that culture, in that world, it was just too big of a step for the people to understand that a woman could be free like a man could be free. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is that there was no such thing as freedom for women. Women were property, period. And so she belonged to a master. It was too big of a step for God to say, okay, women are just as free as men. But he introduces something in this, and he says, okay, I'm going to give an option for this couple, this family, to stay together. It will mean the sacrifice of the man's freedom, because he loves both the master and the woman and the children. He's going to have to stay a slave forever. Doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't probably make sense to you, but there is a redemption that God adds to this that we just have to sort of find a way to get our mind around, if we can enter into that world. Now, if we think about this, what does this mean? Which one of the 10 do these hit on? In a way, number 8, again, freedom. Voluntarily giving up your freedom is a freedom that you have, right? You can choose to not be free. You can choose to say, I will make myself a slave. If somebody else forces you into it, that's not freedom. But for you to choose, it's sort of like the difference between saying, I want to work for this company for the rest of my life versus, and you know, they have that in Japan, right? This idea of you work for one company your whole life. Versus, I want to be my own boss and have my own business. And it's like choosing to work for one company your whole life instead of having the freedom to go and start your own business. So freedom is there. Number 7, I think, is also implied there, because it's about honoring the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. Sex is sacred. And therefore God says that here's a way for sex to remain sacred. Because what happens when a woman is separated from her husband in that culture? She's no longer protected sexually. And so God gives a way for the man to protect his family and his wife's sexual relationship with her. Yeah. So let's carry on. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, now just even that is is hard for us to grasp, right? A man sells his daughter as a slave. Okay, so what does this mean? Again, people seen as property, especially women in that culture. Instead of the man selling himself for paying off his debt, he sells his daughter off. It's horrible, right? We can't fathom it. And yet, there are parameters that God adds to this, that he tries to redeem something that is, in that culture, a common thing. Like, in that culture, you sell your daughter off, you're never going to see her again. She's gone. She's no longer ever part of your family. She's gone. But God says this: if she does not please her master, he who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. Redeemed. That wasn't possible in the other cultures. You couldn't redeem someone just because they didn't please a master. In that culture, the master would have the right to resell her. And God's saying, you can't resell her. Now, to us, we miss that part because we get stuck on the selling your daughter part, right? But remember what I said, God is trying to move them from a really horrible culture, the ancient Near East world, and he's trying to take them a step forward towards something that we now live in today, of the value of women in our world. And so he says, you can't sell her, she can be redeemed, which means the father can come and buy her back. Isn't that amazing? He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, meaning, okay, instead of taking her for himself as his wife, he gives this woman to her son as his wife. Because this is really what we're talking about. We're talking about women for sex. We're talking about women being sold as concubines or as wives. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. That is amazing. We don't see the redemption in there because we think, well, of course he's going to treat her like. No. In that world, you bought slaves for sex and you used them and you threw them away. That's the horrible reality of that world. And so, a man buying a woman for his son, he has to treat her like his own daughter. Isn't that amazing? Number 5, honoring others. It's about elevating the woman's position, because if you treat her like your daughter, that means she is no longer a slave. She is now part of your family. If you're gonna go out and you're gonna buy a woman for your son, you have to make her his wife, and you have to treat her and elevate her status up to the position of family. That's what he's saying. That's redemption. And that was unlike any other law in any other country that surrounded them. Now, he knows that people are wicked, right? So some of the laws that he makes are designed around this idea that God knows how horrible we can be with one another. Remember Paul said, or I think it was Jesus, I can't remember which of the two said this, but he said, Moses gave you divorce because he knew your hearts. But it's not the plan of God. Meaning, there are some laws that God gives us because he understands the condition of our hearts. He knows who we are. He knows that we are going to break faith. and not follow the 10. We're not going to do what we're supposed to do. So in verse 11 it says, if he takes another wife to himself. Okay, so he's had this one woman. He's made her his wife. The family has elevated her position to a daughter. And now the son goes and gets another wife. Polygamy was common in that era. Doesn't mean it's right, but that was the world in which they lived. And so he gives some rules around what happens if you do that. He says, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. You do these 3 things, or she gets to go home to her family for free. Don't diminish her food. Nourish her body. Take care of her physically. And take care of her sexually. You have to do those 3 things for her, or she's a free woman. And she doesn't have to live in this polygamous marriage anymore. That was unheard of. There was no such thing as freedom for women or freedom from marriage for a woman. Like, a man could get out of a marriage in that culture, but for a woman to get out of a marriage because it wasn't fair for her, there was no such option. But God is saying there's a way out. Number 8, freedom. Number 7, sex is sacred. Number 5, honor others. See how the 10 weave into these? Okay, next thing. Verse 12, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. Okay, straightforward. You hit someone, you kill them, you're going to die. However, verse 13, but if he did not lie in wait for him, what does that mean? If he didn't plan the death. Okay? Death happens sometimes in life, right? You're working on a job site, you are operating a machine together, and the person next to you gets killed because of something you did. Does that mean that you killed him? Yes, it does. But God is saying, if you didn't premeditate it, if you didn't plan it, if you didn't intentionally kill someone, but God let him fall into his hands, that's what it means. It fell into his hands. It's like somehow you're involved in the death. But God let him fall into your hands. Then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. Oh, which means, and this is where we hear later about cities of refuge. And there were cities of refuge set up all throughout Israel, where if you accidentally killed someone, because the law of the land was eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life. You kill someone, you die. It doesn't matter if you didn't mean to kill them. It doesn't matter if it was an accident. If you kill someone, you're going to die. And so God is saying, if you accidentally kill someone, I'm going to provide a way for you to flee. Because the culture around you doesn't understand accidents. All they understand is life for a life. And so God is saying, I'm going to come against that by setting up a way for you to flee from that and have the ability to continue living. What does this mean? Number 6, it means protecting life. So in other words, okay, a life has been taken, but there's a life that's innocent that needs to be protected, and it's the person who actually killed the other person by accident. Now, but if a man so verse 14, but if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. And you ever heard someone saying, or sometimes you read in the scripture, someone's holding on to the horns of the altar. There was this idea that if you went into the holy temple and you somehow clung to the altar, you were safe. You ever heard the word of a sanctuary?
Yeah.
Okay, so we had this idea in our culture where the police are not allowed to enter into a church building to arrest someone. It's sanctuary. You know, you hear people who are refugees and there's an extradition order against them. They will live inside a church building because the law is not allowed to enter to take them away. This is what he's talking about, is that if you willfully, intentionally murder someone, then even if you are in a place of sanctuary, even if you are holding on to the horns of my altar, I authorize people to take you and kill you because you have willfully murdered someone. That's the law. Okay, number 15. Whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Okay, does this mean I walk up to someone and slap them and I get to die?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. It means strike to kill, meaning you're intentionally, physically abusing. In other words, it's not just a heated argument, someone gets upset and punches the other person. Now, it could be taken that way, because in that culture, it's like you didn't do that. You didn't do that to your elders, and it was an incredibly disrespectful thing to do. And so it could be interpreted that way. But the intention behind this is a child who is intentionally going and abusing or even maybe trying to kill their parents. Because the punishment is death.
Wow.
And what he's trying to say is that there is an honor. Number one, I'm here. Number 6, protecting life. I'm here to protect elderly, vulnerable people. Right? Because we're not talking about little children here. We're talking about adult children. People who can actually do harm. Like a little child that slaps you on the knee. Yeah, okay, whatever. You don't go and bring the sword and kill them. Right? But if your son is 28 years old and comes to you with a gun or punches you out and you're 80 years old, that's a different story. That's really what God is getting at here. He's saying there is an honor you need to have for others. And I'm here to protect the life of elderly people who are vulnerable. Number 16, remember which one of the 10 did we have to change because it didn't make sense? Instead of...
Idolatry.
No, sorry, not that one. But the one that everyone thinks is one thing, but it's actually another. Instead of not stealing, it's don't kidnap, right? Which we interpret as freedom. So here we see why we make that connection. Verse 16, whoever steals a man, whoever kidnaps, that's what it's getting at. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. Holy smokes. In that one verse, God is saying, I am against the entire economic system of the ancient Near East. Because that was the foundation of how all the nations of the world around Israel functioned. You went and you stole a man, and you sold him, and somebody bought him and possessed him. you kidnap people. In fact, the entire slave trade that founded the plantations in America and the Caribbean, they were all based on slavery, where people were kidnapped from Africa and brought to America. And a lot of people don't realize that the people doing the kidnapping were other African people. A lot of people don't realize that. In Africa, one group of people, one area of Africa, they would go and they would steal people from other parts of Africa, and they would take them to the slave traders on the coast and get money for people that they had stolen. And so what God is saying is the same thing. He says, if you steal someone and if you buy someone, you deserve death. That one verse undoes a whole array of laws and ways of living in that culture that God says, I don't want you to live that way. There's a higher way, there's a better way. Don't steal. Freedom is the ultimate. 17, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. That's a big one. Cursing. You know, what we say with our mouth produces life or death. Right? We produce life or death out of what we speak. And so, in a way, God is saying this violates the whole idea of protecting life. Because you ever heard the words, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? You ever heard that? It's totally not true. It's a lie. Words can hurt us in ways that a physical assault cannot. And those words linger on and get passed on from generation to generation. There is a pain that comes from evil words. And God is saying, if you are a person who speaks death, if you dishonor your parents, so it's about honor, it's about life. Speak life, don't speak death. Number 18. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and he shall have him thoroughly healed. Interesting idea. You get into a fight and you injure someone. In that world, it's like, well, I injured them. It's their problem. But God is saying, no, it's not their problem, it's yours because you injured them. You have to pay for their time off to recover. And not only that, you have to do everything from that point on until they're fully healed. Meaning, you pay for all of their surgeries. You pay for their food and their lodging if they have to go to a doctor in another city. I'm just, I don't know all the things that would be involved in seeing someone better. It may be that you have to take care of their flock because they can't do it. But if you injure someone, you're responsible. That's a new one to that culture. Now, 20. When a man strikes his slave, okay, so now we've crossed into slavery, this whole area of slavery. So things are different. Again, we're dealing with a cultural change that hasn't taken place yet. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. What? That's what the Israelites are saying. Are you serious? That means that a slave owner can't kill a slave? That's exactly what it says here. But that's not the world of that era. You know, it was common in that era for a slave master, he would have maybe 100 slaves working for him, big operation, big business, whatever, big farm. He would have 100 slaves. And he would take one slave and he would bring that slave in front of all of the other slaves, and he would beat that slave to death and send a signal to all the other slaves. See, I have the right to do this. I can kill you if you don't obey me. And there's no recourse. That was the world that they lived in. And God says, you don't get to live that way. If you are a slave owner and you have a slave, and if you beat your slave and they die, you may very well be killed by that slave's family. I give the right to that slave's family to avenge the death of that man or that woman. That's unheard of in that culture.
It says you're not supposed to mistreat your slaves.
Yeah. And so this is all part about not mistreating your slaves. Now, but if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. So again, because of the culture, you can't kill your slave, but if the slave is able to get up after a beating, after a couple of days, you can't do anything about it. Because again, remember what I said earlier? The culture was here. God was trying to move them way down the road, but he had to take one step at a time. And so the one step forward was, okay, you can't kill your slave. You can't kill your slave. You can beat him, but he has to be able to get up and work again in a couple of days. It seems crazy to us, right? But to that world, to that era, the fact that God said you couldn't kill your slave was amazing. I get to go to work knowing that I get to come home from work. That's what it's saying.
Yeah.
I get to go to work and no one is allowed to kill me. Not even my boss. Okay. Verse 22. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her child comes out, but there is no harm, meaning to the child or the woman, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Okay.
Wow.
Interesting, eh? Isn't that interesting? Women were being elevated by God. Now, for us, again, it's hard for us to grab and understand this world, but I'm trying to give us an insight into it. There was, and I think right now is a good time for me to read some of the laws. Because this idea of, oh, come on. There we go. Gotta get my Kindle to open up here. Okay, so I'm going to read you some of the laws from Egypt and maybe even Babylon here. But here's what would happen. Here's the punishments that would be met out if you were a person living in Egypt and you did something that you weren't supposed to. So, crime, punishment. I'll read the crime and then I'll read the punishment. Encroaching on field boundaries. Do you know what that means? Encroaching. It means that you have a field and you move the fence post to make your field larger than it really is, and you take away some of the land that belongs to your neighbor. Encroaching on the field boundaries of your neighbor. Here's the punishment. Cut off nose and ears and make person a cultivator. You don't get to just move the post back. You lose your nose and your ears, and you actually become a slave of the state. You become a cultivator, which means that now you lose your right to land and you have to go work for someone who owns land. That was the law of Egypt. What about this one in Egypt? Stealing an animal belonging to the royal family. What do you think happens there? Cut off the nose and ears and make person a cultivator.
Oh my God.
Seems like a pattern here, right? What about harem conspiracy? Harem, you know what that means? The royal, the group of women that belong to the king. A conspiracy in the harem. You got your nose and ears cut off. What about this? Speaking falsely, perjury. Okay, so in other words, you intentionally say something that's not true about someone in order for them to have a legal word about it. I think Cameron's onto something over here. I see his hand. He's indicating he understands. You know where we're going with this, don't you, Cameron? Cut off the nose and ears. And send them to Cush. You not only had your noses and ears cut off, but you got sent away to another land. Okay, you steal something. What do you think happens? We don't know, but it's a mutilation.
Oh God.
Because some of the texts that we have dug up, it's unclear what the actual punishment is, but it says mutilation in there. Oaths of witnesses if found lying, again, mutilation. Theft of tomb goods. Okay, where do you think we're going to go with this one?
More?
Cut off the nose and the ears,
my God.
and 50 open wounds.
Ouch.
Repeat offense of libel. What do you think that one is?
No, you.
Cut off nose and ears. The Egyptians, they just loved cutting off noses and ears. Okay. Babylonian. Okay. An adopted child, so these are Babylonian laws. An adopted child disowns his parents. An adopted child says, "You're not my parents. I disown you." So context, we're not talking about little children disowning their parents. We're talking about adult children. So you're raised as an adopted child, you grow up, and then you disown your parents because we don't have social security or any type of pensions available to elderly people in that culture. The way that you were taken care of in that culture was by your children. Okay, so which means that now the parents are old and the son says, "I disown you, I won't take care of you. I'm not going to take care of your parents when you get older." So what's the punishment, you think?
Nose and ears.
Nothing about the nose. That's Egypt. But in Babylon, they would cut out the child's tongue.
Oh my gosh.
You can't speak anymore.
Oh my God.
You can't lick ice cream anymore.
Oh.
That era is gone in your life. How about an adopted child runs away to the real father or mother? Pluck out the child's eyes.
Oh my gosh.
What about a wet nurse takes
I'm not
on...
sure if I need many more examples of the gore.
Doesn't do well.
Don't do well.
Okay, we got someone who can't handle... Cameron's enjoying this. His father isn't. We'll end it there. I think you get the idea, right? There is a brutal world that the people live in. the laws that are around Israel are not good laws. They're horrible laws from our world's standard. Like, we look at those things and we say, I don't understand this one. I can't do this one. So we get to this idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn. And again, we read through these laws and we begin to realize that God was trying to do something. He was trying to change the way that Israel approached how they should live life. Trying to use the 10 to guide them in a new way forward. He couldn't take them all the way. He couldn't get them totally out of their culture. But he was saying, I'm going to set you up some laws that will be so vastly different than the laws around you that you'll think that you're in heaven. That you'll think that you finally have something that you've been longing for, which is a new way of living. Now, of course, we look at it and we say, that's not freedom. That's not good. But to them it was. And so when we read through, and we're not going to do the rest of it because it would just take too much time. But my challenge to you is read through the rest of chapter 21, 22, and 23. Read through them and begin to look at the laws and look for the redemptive nature of that law. Look for how God was bringing that law into that world and saying, this is so different than the world around you that I want you to live my way instead of the world's way. You know, Jesus said to us a whole new way of living. He gave us a Sermon on the Mount. And he laid out things that he said, the world says this, but I say this, right? You have been told this, but I'm saying there's a better way. This is the way we approach reading the Bible. When we read the Bible, we have to assume, number one, that God is good. We have to assume that God loves us and that his intention behind what he's written is actually for our good. And if we do a little bit of research, when we read things that just make us think God is crazy, because sometimes if we just take this at face value, we'll think God is unjust and cruel and a horrible God. But if we dig deeper and we read what's behind it, and we do a little bit of understanding of the culture of that day, we will see a God who says, I love you. I love you and I am for you. And not only am I for you, I have ways of living that I want you to live, that if you will live that way, you will experience life to the full. Do you see how we can get there from this? The 10 are a guide for us to look at Scripture and try to look behind the laws. You know, like, and I think that this is where Israel made their mistake, because they focused on all the laws. They got really good at, you know, there's 613 laws or something like that, and we know how to keep every single law, and we will make sure that that law is kept generation by generation. But what they failed to do was look back at the 10 and then look back even further at the first 2. Because the first 2 laws are love God and love others. Right? Jesus said, you can sum up all of the commandments, all of the laws, everything in this one thing: love God and love your neighbor. And if you can love God and love your neighbor, you will understand how to live out all of the other laws. So, if we take this, what we've learned here today, now let's bring it home to where we are today. What are some of the things in our world where we need to redeem or bring in a higher way of doing things that are in alignment with the 10 and with the way that God sees the world. What about employment laws? Okay, so we have, because we've been talking about slavery, employment. If you own a business and you design your business so that nobody can get full-time employment, everyone is only ever able to get 1 hour short of full-time employment, which means that they don't get full benefits. You don't have to legally pay them full benefits. Is that right?
No.
God is saying no. If we look at what the intention behind the 10, the intention behind the 10 is freedom, right? Meaning, if we understand that the ultimate goal of commandment number 8 is freedom for people, we will do things that enable and ensure that they are able to be free, that they will have the ability to provide for their family, that they won't get into debt. What are some of the other laws that we can think about in our land that may need to be changed?
Protecting life.
Protecting life. Protecting all life. Absolutely. You know, we could get into that one a lot here. There are many laws in our land that need to be looked at. Is it right to allow someone to seem to get off when there was an intentional murder or a physical violation of someone else? We could go on, but we sort of run out of time. I think you get the idea. What I'd like you to do is read through the other chapters. Think through what we're talking about, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you a template for life, right? As your pastor, I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life. I'm trying to say there is a pattern that you can follow, that if you go back to the 10 and ultimately the 2, and you begin to see how God laid that out so that it was redemptive in the world that the Israelites lived, you'll understand that the same way that God did it for them, He will do it for you. And there are things in the New Testament that when we read them, all of a sudden it makes sense. That God was trying to redeem something that was broken. You know, there's this book in the New Testament where Paul talks to a slave owner. And in that conversation, he has this conversation with his friend. And his conversation goes something to the effect of, you know, Philemon, there's this guy named Onesimus. He's your slave. And I found him. He became a Christian. And isn't it awesome that he became a Christian? And that now that he's a Christian, he's your brother? And because of the law, I'm sending him back to you, because legally you own this man named Onesimus. But I want you to receive him not as your slave. I want you to receive him as your brother. And I'm asking you to consider what you would do for him and to him, because now he's your brother. That was as far as Paul could go, even in the culture that Jesus lived in, because slavery was still a part of that world. But Paul was saying, you may have the right to treat him like every other slave, but he's a brother now, and maybe there's a better way. That's the way we can read the New Testament, is that it's pushing against the laws of the land and saying, we understand that the laws of the land aren't just. We understand that the world that we live in isn't designed by God. It's designed by fallen men. And so we need to take the 10, take the ultimate 2, and say, how do we bring those to bear on the world that we live in? And how do we become the type of people that bring about change? Bring about transformation. Bring about the kingdom of God in a way that brings life. Aren't the 10 Commandments amazing now? When we look at it from that perspective, the 10 Commandments are about the goodness of God. Yeah. Well, let's pray. Father, we thank you that you are a good God. We thank you that you are showing us how, even in the ancient Near East culture that the Israelites grew up in, were raised in, were living in, that you are redeeming them from the world around them. And you're doing the same thing for us today. And I pray that you would give us eyes to see and hearts to hear how your 10 Commandments can instruct us and guide us for the world that we live in today. I ask your blessing on us as we go into the work that we do throughout this week. And I pray that you would help us to orient ourselves around your law. Because your law is life. Your law is good. When we understand the nature behind it and the character that you have towards us as you give us those. Bless us now and go with us as we serve you throughout this week. In Jesus' name.